Try that again. Morning, everybody. We're going to get started. It's 9:30 on a Friday. Thank you all for coming. This is the Human Rights Protocol Consideration Research Group. We will go ahead and get started. We want to welcome you all. We have a couple of talks, folks that have traveled all this way to present today. And then a few drafts at the end. We'll have a bit of time for a discussion about this research group's very minor recharter and an update on that. And I'll come back to the agenda in a second. We can review it. Okay. But before we get started, please remember you need to wear a mask unless you're drinking or eating or speaking at the mic. Please use the mobile or other Meet Echo tool to get in the queue. You just scan your QR code. I know most of us have been here all week, but there are some folks who have just come for this session. And then also kind reminder that this is being recorded. It'll be on YouTube after. We have a few slides that we call the Note Well. So it's about disclosing, especially in the IRTF, as well as in the IETF, if you have any intellectual property rights, you need to disclose them. We do audio and video recordings. It's also, I should mention, this is on IceCast, streaming live as well. And then we have a privacy and code of conduct that are pretty important, but you can read all the details at your leisure. I will dwell on the code of conduct as usual. That's really important. It's changed in the last few years to include more rigorous definitions of like the anti-harassment procedures and things like that. Right. So the IRTF has some explicit goals that are separate from the IETF. We're looking at the longer term issues related to the internet. The IETF is focused on the engineering and standards making that are more short term. HRPC has been around for several years now. We're coming up on I think on a decade soon, not long. We are conducting research. We're not developing standards. We tend to publish drafts and documents. Some of them are drafts, some of them are not drafts, that are informational or experimental. I don't think we've done anything experimental. It's all just been informational. Yeah, giving people ideas, I can tell in the audience. And yeah, if you want to know more about the IRTF, there's lots and lots of research groups that have met here this week, and it's all documented, and you can read more about it. And join lists and really learn more about it. What is happening? Okay, great. So you are here. This is the Human Rights Protocol Considerations. We are rechartering, so I've hopefully, I guess, aspirationally replaced the P with policy, because that's the main fundamental change there. I'm just trying it out, seeing what the slide looks like. We'll get there at the end of this. But like I mentioned, we've been around for several years now. We are explicitly trying to do three things. We're mostly just uncovering the relationship between human rights as its own kind of standard framework, and the Internet Protocols development process, and the protocols themselves. We especially focus in the human rights framework on free expression and free assembly, but we've also talked about privacy, although that's a very direct overlap with the privacy research group, and other things. The second goal is we're trying to develop guidance for the engineers. We actually say guidelines to the IETF in our charter at the moment. But that's useful, and we have a document that's in the publishing queue right now that does that. And then lastly, really, we're increasing awareness, and just by bringing in speakers, by talking about these issues, we're trying to talk to the human rights community about Internet protocol standardization. Some of us were in Geneva not long ago, talking to the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights in a session before the UN about the importance of the IETF and other SDOs. And then we're also trying to obviously increase awareness here in the technical community and how the internet impacts human rights. So those are our main objectives. All of our work follows under those. And this is our current work. So you have Sophia and I up here that do the co-chairing stuff. We also have other folks to thank. So DKG and Melinda Shore are our technical advisors. They have been really helpful in the past for various documents. And then Nick Doty is currently a doc shepherd for Draft Association. So there are roles like that that come up from time to time. And we always appreciate folks who volunteer and help us out. We have two drafts that are active and the research group has adopted. The first is a version 18 document on guidelines for human rights protocol considerations. This is the one I was talking about before. It's based off of our RFC 8280 that talks about the human rights protocol considerations. This breaks it down, gives it a little bit more contour in terms of what protocol engineers might consider. It's shorter, but still, I think, robust. We're going to get the update on that later. And then freedom of association on the internet really looks at the rights to free assembly and free association in the digital age. And actually, this is no longer under Shepherd review. The Shepherd review is done. It's back to, I think it's going to the IETF chair. But anyway, again, updates coming. And then we have a new draft, which we'll get to. We'll have a presentation on that. It's a version 00 on considerations when basically, your endpoints, everything is sort of exposed to an intimate partner intimate partner abuse. Thank you. Gosh, sorry. Morning. All right, so this I think is where we're at. So let me toggle back to our agenda for any review. So again, we're here at the top. Can I also, because I have to put this on the slide or I always forget, is there somebody who can take notes for us? It probably won't. You can cruise for an hour because there are going to be talks. But then once we get into talking about our drafts, it'd be really nice. You are the best. Thank you. Okay, we've got notes. Review. Any changes to the agenda? Do folks have any other business? We probably have time for it at the end. Okay, well, we can get there. All right, with that, I think I'll invite Micah Lee up. Micah, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because I didn't get a bio in the beginning, but so please do, and we're really happy to have you. So I'm going to let you sit here, right? And then you can put your laptop down. Okay, great. Okay.
Hello. Welcome to my talk. I made a lot of slides that I'm going to go through, but they're all on Data Tracker, so I'm going to go through them very quickly. But if you want to review them, you can find them. Okay, so my name is Micah Lee. I'm the Director of Information Security at The Intercept, which is a nonprofit news organization in the United States. I also develop software, open source software like OnionShare and Danger Zone. I started working in investigative journalism in 2013 when I helped Edward Snowden securely communicate with the journalists that he leaked documents to. So this talk is about a book that I've spent the last year and a half writing that's going to be published pretty soon. The goal of it is to teach journalists and researchers how to analyze hacked and leaked documents. I thought that this would be of interest to IETF and specifically to the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group. And so this book, it's kind of like an interactive course, complete with homework assignments that you follow. All you need is a laptop that's running Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, an internet connection, and about 1 terabyte of disk space. The release date isn't final yet, but it'll probably be around September. And so in this talk, I'm going to give an overview of the main skills that people need to analyze hacked and leaked data sets, and I'm going to use a lot of examples from real data sets. So everyone deserves to have the skills to analyze hacked and leaked data sets, regardless of their income or what country they're from. And so just to try and remove barriers to access, I'm also releasing the book under a Creative Commons license. So there is a lot of hacked and leaked data online. I come across data sets so frequently that it feels like I'm drowning in data, and there's no way that I'll have time to analyze them all or even most of them for newsworthy parts. So here are just a few data sets that have been published by Distributed Denial of Secrets, which is a nonprofit leak archive that I work with, that they've made available since the beginning of 2023. So in January, software and documentation for two different phone forensics companies, Celebrate and MSAT, were dumped online. And these are tools that are that police use to extract data like text messages and emails and photos from phones that they seize. And they're frequently used against activists and journalists. And this is just, one of the data sets that there's been very little people looking at, very little reporting on it so far. But it's out there. Also in January, 1 million emails from Brazil's National Arts Foundation were dumped online. And also 19 gigs of data from Odin Intelligence was dumped online. This is a company that builds software that's used by local police departments across the United States. This one is full of information about interagency police raids. A snapshot of TSA's no-fly list was dumped online from 2019. Yeah, and so then in February, DDoS Secrets, Distributed Denial of Secrets, published a second leak from Roskomnadzor, which is the Russian government agency in charge of internet censorship, basically. The first time that they published a leak from this agency was last year, right after Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was at the same time where dozens of other data sets related to Russian companies and government agencies were all leaked online. And so this hasn't really been reported yet, but this specific data set includes information about Roskomnadzor censoring DDoS Secrets itself. Here's a PDF that was attached to an email in this latest leak that basically shows a request to add DDoSsecrets.com to Russia's domain name censorship list. A few weeks ago, the city of Oakland had a lot of data hacked, and it includes like police officer disciplinary records, including for supervisors who failed to report misconduct. And then actually there was another release that just happened yesterday, but is not in the slides, of Apex Mobile. It's a company that police departments in the United States and Canada use to make like branded police department apps where people can like post pictures and submit tips to the police. Like all of the tips have been leaked. Okay, so that's just an example of just how much data there is. There's very few people looking at all of this data that have the skills to do it. So before you start working on hacked and leaked data like this, it's important to start with some baseline digital security skills. And so that's how I am starting the book. So the first part of the book is the least technical, but it's still very important. And so some of the homework assignments include starting to use a password manager for yourself, making sure your hard drive is encrypted. You encrypt a USB hard drive, which you'll then use to download data sets throughout the book. And then there's also, they're very important part of verifying that data is authentic. You can't believe stuff that you read on the internet, including big data sets that are leaked. And so there's a lot about how to verify authenticity. And then it goes into a lot about how to go about acquiring data sets, either like directly from sources and how to securely do it, or how to download public data sets online. And part of the homework for this is everyone downloads a copy of BlueLeaks. BlueLeaks was, it's a 270 gigabyte data set from 2020. And and it contains data from hundreds of law enforcement fusion center websites around the United States. In the middle of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, somebody hacked the company that ran this software that ran all of these police websites, and leaked it all. And so this was this data set's used extensively throughout the book. Okay, so after that stuff, journalists and researchers need to start learning more technical skills. And so it starts, the technical parts start with basically the command line interface. So this is a prerequisite for most of the tools and technologies that are used that you're going to need, going forward. People who have never used the terminal are often kind of afraid of it, but it's not that hard to learn the basics. And so I gave a crash course on things like how to use the terminal, tab completion, relative and absolute paths, how to use package managers and text editors, simple shell scripts. When you download BlueLeaks, it's basically like a few hundred zip files. And so one of the homework assignments is you use a bash for loop to unzip them all on a single command. And so there's like a lot of like automation that you can do. And also I know that a lot of people use Windows, and I didn't want to leave them out. So Windows is fully supported, mostly using the Windows subsystem for Linux. And when that's not available, there's other instructions to make sure that Windows users can just completely follow along and do all of this as well. So for example, here's a little excerpt from the book. So this teaches people how to use grep to search through file names. And so in this case, the reader had created a file called BlueLeaks filenames.txt by using find and then piping the output, and then redirecting the output into a file. And now they're grepping this file, searching for the word for the string Antifa to basically find file names that mention Antifa. And here are the files in the BlueLeaks data set that mention the string Antifa in their file names. So this is one way to quickly find interesting documents in huge data sets with hundreds of gigabytes of files. But yeah, this is only actually searching the file names themselves, not the content of the files. So grep is great for searching file names, and it's also great for searching the contents of plain text files. So like specific types of files like CSVs or JSON files, but it doesn't work for most other types of files that you end up seeing, like PDFs or Office documents, or even emails. Emails are plain text files, but they very frequently use MIME encoding, which means there's a lot of base 64, and so you can't grep base 64 encoded data. So if you want to search the contents of all of these different files, you can use software called Aleph. Aleph is open source investigative software that is developed by OCCRP. It's the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. They run their own Aleph server that's public at data.occrp.org. They have a bunch of public data sets on there, and also for journalists, they give out accounts that gives you access to even more private data sets. But you could also run your own Aleph server, and it's really useful for basically indexing data sets, and it does entity extraction and OCR and all sorts of stuff like that. It lets you cross-reference between different data sets to find connections. So you can run your own Aleph server on your laptop using Docker, and it's not that hard to do. And so here's a screenshot from the book. In this case, I indexed data from IceFishX. It's one of the fusion centers in BlueLeaks. It's a partnership between law enforcement agencies in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And this shows a unclassified law enforcement sensitive document a few days after George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis cop. And it basically is just warning of increased threats to police due to the Black Lives Matter protests. And also in response to DDoS Secrets publishing Blue Leaks in 2020, German authorities seized a DDoS Secrets server that contained all of its data sets at the request of the FBI. But they didn't actually really suppress Blue Leaks journalism because it was all available on BitTorrent. So email dumps is another very common form of leaked data set. So I have a whole chapter about reading other people's email, and it goes into email message formats and email protocols, and it specifically focuses on the file formats that email dumps commonly come in, which are EML files, MBEX files, and PST Outlook files. So here is an example of part of a email dump from the Nauru police force imported into Thunderbird. And so this shows a screenshot. So Nauru is a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean that hosts abuse-ridden offshore detention centers for the Australian government. And this shows an email written by the president of Nauru telling the chief of Nauru police to ignore an Australian journalist's email that was asking about asking questions about two Nauru men who had allegedly attacked a refugee worker and possibly ran him over with a car and stole his motorbike. So tools like Aleph and using the command line and Thunderbird are great, but they don't work with most data sets. They just work with specific types of data. And so for a lot of data sets, the only way to make sense of it is to write your own code. So I start going over a crash course of Python programming for beginners, and it specifically focuses on traversing the file system, working with data structures and dictionaries and lists, which are very common things to do. Let's see, I should probably actually speed things up. But basically, I just wanted to show a very quick example of some Python code for data analysis. Right after Russia invaded Ukraine, a ransomware group called Conti published this statement. And Conti is known for extorting hundreds of millions of dollars from companies, and specifically they target healthcare companies. Right after they published this statement, a Ukrainian security researcher basically dumped 30 gigs of internal documents from Conti online, including chat logs and hacking tools and things like that. Here is just a little example of a snippet of the chat logs from Rocket Chat. In this is a single message. In this message, it translates to: some American senators suggest blocking Pornhub in Russia in addition to social networks. And this was right when US and Europe started imposing economic sanctions on Russia. And Russia just started censoring access to Facebook and Twitter, and they were very concerned about this. Pornhub never did actually block access to Russians, though. So here's a little excerpt of some Python code. The code at the top basically opens up a JSON file and parses it. And then the code at the bottom is just a for loop that loops through every chat message and displays it in a much nicer format that's easier to read, and also in a format that you can copy and paste into machine translation software. And so a lot of data comes in formats like this where you have to figure out how it works, write little bits of code, and then it makes it way simpler to work with. So another common format is spreadsheets, and specifically CSV files. And so here's another example of something that I found in a CSV file. So I grabbed the contents of CSV files in Blue Leaks in the NCRIC folder, which is the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center for the word Antifa. And here is something that I found in SARS.csv, which is suspicious activity reports, which are basically rumors or leads that people in the law enforcement community post to fusion centers about things that might or might not be illegal. So in this case, here are the relevant fields in the CSV that are a lot easier to read. And a lot of the homework involves like loading CSV files and looping through every row and making it easier to read in ways like this. And this shows that someone from Marin County's District Attorney Office, which is just north of San Francisco, submitted this suspicious activity report on June 5th, 2020 at 2:20 p.m. They set the category to radicalization/extremism. And basically, it says that they received a letter from a lawyer who was contacted by a student, an Oregon student. And the student appears to be a member of the Antifa group and is assisting in planning protesting efforts in the Bay Area despite living in Oregon. And then it makes a reference to letter.pdf. So here is the scanned letter from the lawyer written in all caps. Please see the attached solicitation I received from an Antifa terrorist wanting my help to bail her and her friends out of jail if arrested for rioting. He ends the letter with happy hunting. And then goes on to show the actual original message that the student sent, which is polite, and she just says she's compiling a list of lawyers and law firms to be willing to do pro bono representation for Black Lives Matter protests. And so this ended up getting angering a lawyer so much that he mailed it to a DA's office, who then uploaded it as a suspicious activity report to the Northern California Police Intelligence Agency. So back when I was doing this, I found that Blue Leaks is kind of difficult to find interesting stuff like this unless you spend a lot of time digging into the CSV files. And so I built some custom code to make it way easier called Blue Leaks Explorer. And so I've released this software. It's a GPL license along with the book. So if you download a copy of Blue Leaks, you can use it with the software to make it way easier to investigate it. So another very common file format the data comes in is JSON. And so I spent a chapter going deep into JSON, and specifically I used a bunch of JSON data related to the January 6th insurrection. So on January 6th, 2021, anti-democracy activists stormed the US Capitol trying to make sure that Donald Trump stayed in power after he lost the election. And so using their phones, they all took photos and videos, and a lot of times they these videos included GPS coordinates in the metadata, and they posted them online in real time. Many of them posted videos to Parler, which is a far-right social network. So after the January 6th attack, Parler refused to moderate content that incited violence, and so Apple and Google banned their apps from the App Store, and then AWS announced that they'd give Parler a few days before they kicked them off the service because they wouldn't remove content that incited violence. So before that happened, a archivist named Donk NB downloaded 32 terabytes of videos from Parler. And that's over 1 million videos, and that's 32 terabytes is a lot of disk space. That's like 64 times the amount of disk space on the laptop that I'm using. And then she worked with DDoS Secrets to make them all available to the public. And many of the videos were ultimately used in Donald Trump's second impeachment inquiry. So 32 terabytes is way too much data to reasonably download for anyone. You basically have to store them in S3 buckets and things like that. So Donk used a command line tool called exif tool to basically extract metadata from each video. And there's a zip file full of metadata for each video. So here's a screenshot of over 1 million JSON files. Each one is metadata for a different video. And it's when you unzip it, it's 2 gigabytes of JSON files. And so here's an excerpt of the book from the book using a tool called JQ, which is a great tool for working with JSON. And you can see in this metadata file This one has exact GPS coordinates. And so since so many of these videos had GPS coordinates, it's possible to map out the Parler videos, include like everything uploaded to Parler, but including everything uploaded on January 6th. And here you can see journalists at Gizmodo reported that the pro-Trump rioters breached deep inside the Capitol building. And later ProPublica, which is a nonprofit newsroom, published an interactive website where you can like look at different parts of Washington, D.C. throughout the day, and like inside of the Capitol or right outside the Capitol, and the timeline, and it's all based on the Parler data set. So here's like a homework assignment that's part of the book that involves looping through the million JSON metadata files and filtering out the ones that were from January 6th that have GPS coordinates, and then saving them in a KML format, which is keyhole markup language. It's a geographic format that's designed to work with Google Earth. And so then you could upload these files and basically like make your own maps of geographic data to visualize yourself. So another common format is SQL. SQL databases that hack data comes in. And I use a bunch of hack data from a hosting company called Epic as an example. Epic is a company that's run by a Christian nationalist, and they provide domain name registration and hosting services to hate groups and a lot of far-right extremist groups. And so, for example, they provide domain registration services for oathkeepers.org. And so if you do a whois lookup for oathkeepers.org, you can see that their who is the ownership information for this domain name is hidden behind a privacy service. But if you import the Epic data into a SQL server and run the query yourself, you could actually see that in this case, oathkeepers.org is owned by someone named Edward Durfee, who lives in New Jersey, who runs a company called eJam Systems. And if you look at a separate leak from Oathkeeper's emails, Edward Durfee is the Oathkeeper's IT support person. He signs his emails IT support. The Epic data is also really interesting. It has a lot of domain name information about many extremist sites and neo-Nazi sites, and it has information about Jim Watkins, who runs 8kun, which was formerly 8chan, and who's most likely the person behind QAnon. Okay, so then finally, I go into a few in-depth case studies of reporting that I've done in the past. And so I won't go into very much detail about them here, but here's a few high-level overviews of how they work. So America's Frontline Doctors is a very well-funded anti-vaccine disinformation group. During the pandemic, they made many millions of dollars lying to the public about vaccine safety and then selling fake COVID-19 cures, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. A hacker contacted me and sent me a copy of all of their patient data, basically. So in the case study, I basically describe how I started out with 2 compressed files full of JSON files and CSV files, and then use them to unravel this whole big network of healthcare fraud. And so over a 2-month period where I have patient data, patients spent $6.7 million on $90 telehealth consultations where they basically have like doctor's appointments. And I only have had 2 months of data, but they have been operating for several more months. And so if they were making the same amount of money on average, then likely they made an additional $18 million just on people making doctor's appointments, basically. And then over a 9-month period, the pharmacy they worked with, people spent $8.7 million on fake COVID-19 medicine. the reporting led to a congressional investigation into America's frontline doctors and the healthcare companies that they work with. So another case study involves neo-Nazi chat logs that were collected by anti-fascist infiltrators in 2017. So in August 2017, hundreds of white supremacists spent a weekend in Charlottesville, Virginia, for the Unite the Right rally. And they came from groups like Vanguard America, Identity Europa, League of the South, the Ku Klux Klan. One neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd of anti-fascist counter-protesters, killing one person, Heather Heyer, and injuring 19 other people. And Donald Trump, in response to all the violence, famously said that there were very fine people on both sides. So this nonprofit news collective called Unicorn Riot got a bunch of chat logs from the Discord servers that fascists had used to organize the violence in Charlottesville. And so some anti-fascist infiltrators basically like talked their way into these groups, and then they just scraped the entire chat rooms. And they also got chat logs from many other Discord servers. And so at the time, the like American fascist movement was completely organized on Discord. And so Unicorn Riot ended up getting the chat logs of several different chat rooms. So journalists at Unicorn Riot sent me copies of some of the logs to see if I wanted to analyze them and do any reporting on them. And I found that it was way easier to do this if I made a custom tool called Discord Analysis. And so I made a custom tool, and this is a screenshot of the custom tool. And yeah, it ended up I ended up sharing a copy of it with them after I did my reporting, and this turned into a website the Unicorn Riot runs called Discord Leaks. And so today, Discord Leaks has hundreds of thousands of messages that are from dozens of different fascist chat rooms. It's expanded just from Discord to also Rocket Chat. And it's an important tool that's used by extremism researchers. And so survivors of the violence in Charlottesville sued the Unite the Right organizers, basically trying to bankrupt the American fascist movement. And they kind of succeeded. The lawyers used Discord leaks to gather evidence for their initial lawsuit. And they said, while our team eventually subpoenaed the full servers from Discord itself, these initial leaks provided crucial early information that made the speed and breadth of the initial complaint possible. And the Unite the Right organizers and specific fascist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were ordered to pay $25 million in damages. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so, arigato gozaimasu. Yeah, I guess we have just a few minutes for Q&A. Thank you. Yeah.
Please either put your questions in the chat or go to the different mics if you have any question.
Hello, Niels ten Hoover, University of Amsterdam, with the mic on. Thanks so much for the presentation, for writing the book, and for making it available under Creative Commons license. That's great. I was very curious whether you also have a chapter on ethical considerations vis-a-vis information in the leaks and sensitive information in there, and how you think students, researchers, and the audience of your book should deal with that, and how you think about that when you approach leaks.
Yes. Yeah. So in the whole first section of the book about the very important but not as technical stuff, there's different levels of ethical considerations. A big part of it is source protection. So there's lots of situations where you might really, it would be good to publish original documents, but that might actually harm the source. So you might decide to just not publish things at all or things like that. But then there's also a lot of ethical considerations around what data to publish, what data to redact, and basically, in general, even if data is freely available on the internet, anyone can get it. You know, if there's private personal information, like you shouldn't publish the actual details, personal details about people, unless you have a very compelling reason to. But yeah, there's a big section about ethical considerations.
We have some people on the queue. So Gilling, you're online, I think. Can you mute yourself for the question? Okay, he removed himself. Okay, we have Alexander on the queue as well.
Test. All right. Do you plan or do you have a chapter which talks about how to encourage people to produce leaks? Because the examples you provided and the ones we see in the news come from either the US or westernized countries. I come from a small country in Eastern Europe, and this rarely happens. So the journalists don't have data to work with. What would you do to help somehow change social attitudes towards this and make people more aware of the potential power they have?
That's a good question. I mean, the book doesn't actually cover this at all, but I think that there are lots of leaks all around the world. And like personally, because I'm American, because this is the stuff that I know the best, and also because I speak English and I don't speak other languages very well, this is what I tend to cover the most. But I have actually seen plenty of like leaks from Eastern Europe and from other places where it's just like, it just goes way over my head. And so I tend to just not even touch it. So one thing that I'm hoping is that if more people do start digging into what is available and doing more local journalism around the world, that I think that that's actually the biggest thing that you can do to encourage, you know, more leaks like this happening is if people see actual impact come from them. So if people see journalism and reporting come from them.
Thanks.
Lars, yes.
Good morning, Lars Eggert. So I have a question that's maybe a bit more technical, but all of your analysis seems to be based basically on leaks of stored data, dumps, right? And in the IETF, it's mostly about the network. So I'm wondering if you have any example of something where somebody took a network trace and analyzed it, or not, right? Which would mean that end-to-end encryption maybe works very well. I wonder if you can sort of talk a little bit about that space.
I don't have examples of that, but I do think that, you know, if there's like PCAP files that get leaked or something, that would definitely make, that could potentially make very interesting investigative journalism. There actually is like an appendix in the book that's all about web scraping. So it's not quite the same, but it's basically showing you how to, you know, use like beautiful soup and Selenium and things like that to gather your own data sets and scrape them yourself. But yeah, I think that a lot of the more active stuff gets into much more legal gray areas. And so that's just depending on what project you're doing, you probably want to consult lawyers.
Thanks.
And last we have David.
Yeah, I had two questions, but a quick comment on that. I think there's a lot of stuff that happens with geolocation data. Usually governments will use it against people, but I wonder if there's stuff like that that kind of starts to connect a bit more to the network. It could be interesting cross-section, like recently the Russian father of the child that drew a picture of Ukraine got arrested in Belarus. I think that was just yesterday because he turned on his phone. So like that kind of data, I'm sure, is floating around out there. But yeah, I had two questions. One was regarding the ethical stuff. I was wondering if you covered at all about stenographic techniques, because even if you redact a name and you're like, okay, this is safe to put out this original document. I blurred out the names. The stenographic techniques could be used against the leaker or the whistleblower. Do you?
Yeah. So, so basically, when you receive documents, the choices that you make about publishing them are like from the safest in terms of protecting your source is don't publish the documents at all, don't publish images of them, or don't quote them. Instead, just describe what is in it, because that way it makes a lot more ambiguity around exactly which documents this information even came from. But that needs to be balanced against like transparency to your readers, because when you show actual documents, it makes it much more clear that this is real. But then, if you do want to publish, you can just quote from it. So not actually publish documents, but just publish quotes that you type. If you don't want to publish documents, you can recreate the documents. So instead of, if it's audio, you can record audio yourself reading, what somebody else had said, so that you don't release their voice. If it's like text documents, you retype the documents in your own thing. So that if there is any sort of hidden watermarks or any other hidden information, that won't be included if you reproduce the documents. So yeah, there's like a whole range of things, like where the most transparent but kind of least secure in terms of protecting your source is just publishing the raw documents, and then the most transparent, or the least transparent but most secure in terms of protecting your source is just not publishing anything and just describing what they contain.
Right. Okay. Thanks. And sorry, I forgot my second question, so I'll grab you later if I remember it.
All right. Sounds good.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Micah.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Up next, we have Leah, who is going to, Mari's return, who is going to have a presentation about what it means to design cryptography for grassroots organization. She is a PhD candidate from Brown University under the supervision of Sunny Camara. And she has been doing a lot of wonderful work about what it means to design for activists. And if you want to learn more about her research, there was a really wonderful real world crypto talk that she did on Tuesday, I think, if you want to go into the more technical details. You go ahead.
She needs my phone to do the slide transition.
Hi, my name is Leah Namisa Rosenblum. I'm here to talk about cryptography, the internet, and grassroots organizing. This is joint work with Sunny Camara. I want to start with a quote that cryptography rearranges power. And this is true depending on the circumstance, but I think a more accurate rephrasing of this is that cryptography, the internet, and other technologies we develop has the potential to rearrange power. And the subtext there is that oftentimes these technologies serve to maintain systems of power that already operate and exist. And so this leads to the question, power for whom and to what ends? So this talk invites you to consider the following questions. How do we, as people who create and maintain powerful technologies, understand systems of power? How does this understanding inform our priorities, threat modeling, and design choices? And finally, how might we work toward building power for communities? So in starting to answer some of these questions for ourselves, we came up with a kind of protocol design paradigm shift. The first property of which is a design justice property that one size fits one. So we really have to start our design process with the actual needs of the population we are trying to serve with our designs. Second, that trust is fundamentally a human property, that digital trust is just an extension of highly complex human trust relationships. And that we want to work towards a more holistic notion of threat modeling in our designs that covers messy human existence as much as possible. And finally, we want to start to optimize our designs for communities rather than corporations and governments. So this is the overall organization of the talk. We've already looked at the introduction and the paradigm shift, and I want to give some definitions and historical context next. We define grassroots organizing as a process by which people work from within marginalized communities to affect social, political, economic, and environmental change. And I want to start the historical examples with an alternate reimagining of the internet that took place in Chile in the 1970s. And the goal of this project was to create a decentralized worker-owned platform where these networks of telex machines in factories would allow workers to communicate things like working conditions and material needs directly to the government. And this plan was to be expanded to people's homes as well. They would give planning to give every home a telex machine. So this we didn't really get to see how this would pan out because this was destroyed in the military coup, but it is a nice example of what the internet design process might have looked like with a grassroots first, like bottom up design rather than top down. The second historical example I want to give is the first known instance of cryptography for grassroots organizing. And this is Operation Vula, which took place in South Africa, where activists in the African National Congress created a crypto system to fight against apartheid. Sunny Kamara has a very detailed description of this ingenious crypto system in his 2020 Crypto for the People talk, so I won't go into the details. But I do want to highlight an activist take on this, on cryptography here. So they said, I went to find out about secure encryption algorithms. All I discovered was that cryptology was an arcane science for bored mathematicians, not for underground activists. However, I learned a few tricks and used these to develop a system to meet our security needs. So I think this is a really important opinion to highlight, that it's not important only to develop protocols, it's also important to communicate and make that knowledge and the design process accessible to the people we're trying to reach with our designs. Next, COINTELPRO, which was an intelligence gathering operation in the United States, illustrated the extent to which state powers are able to illegally and extensively surveil activists. And this also showed the blurring of boundaries between information gathering and physical violence. So the information gathered as part of COINTELPRO led to assassination, for instance, of Fred Hampton, and the incarceration of many other activists. And we learned about the techniques in this operation through the Church Committee report, which was leaked, and no meaningful oversight and accountability this report also detailed no meaningful oversight. And we know that there's digital equivalents have been brought into the current era via the Snowden disclosures. Finally, I want to talk about the Arab Spring, which was important for many reasons that happened between 2010 and 2012. And this was really the first time that social media was used extensively to organize. So this increased the speed at which people were able to organize, the amount of information they were able to disseminate, and also the number of people they were able to reach with that information. And people who study the role of social media in the Arab Spring are also quick to label social media as a facilitator rather than a direct or independent cause of change. And so this inspired countless other movements. And will bring us kind of into the present day. So we'll look at some lessons from the current landscape that are gleaned from studies of contemporary grassroots movements. I want to frame this conversation using modes of suppression. So the last 5 of these modes are facilitated by information technology. And conspicuous and covert surveillance speak to the importance of having confidentiality, so the protection of the information that's being transmitted over the network, and anonymity, the protection of people's identities. Deception and mass media influence speak to the need for integrity of information and also trust in information that you are seeing online. So the last 2 sets of properties here are often at odds with each other, and we'll look a little bit at how activists manage this tension in the next slide. Censorship is also an important mode of suppression as well, and speaks to the need to have more decentralized networks and also to make access to these technologies more accessible to people. So this first study looks at how Anti-Corruption Foundation activists manage the trade-off between being safe and being visible while organizing. The first observation is that they're using conspicuous security. So they're not only using services like Tor, encryption, and VPNs, they're also teaching people how to use these services openly. They're also using strategic visibility to be transparent in their actions and to create a sense of community. This is echoed in Hong Kong protests, where there are bigger public groups and smaller encrypted groups. And to join those smaller encrypted groups, there is a rigorous onboarding process with who gets invited into those groups. Next is an observation I made after having 50 conversations with Black Lives Matter activists in 2020. And that observation is that digital trust really reduces to physical trust. The reason for this is that the speed and intensity with which information is generated online often creates a sense of a lack of information integrity. So people were reading things, they weren't sure if the groups were legitimate, the organizers were legitimate. They would show up and it would be a space that was full of Proud Boys, for example. And so the way that they were combating this is really falling back on their community networks, word of mouth, checking with people, hey, do you know who's organizing this event? And then going in strength in numbers. This was also echoed in Hong Kong, excuse me, where face-to-face preceded phone-to-phone, because to quote one activist, standing on the front line together is very important for trust. Similarly, a study of activists in Ukraine and during the Euromaidan uprising found that they were using physical spaces to aid with technological education and accessibility. So they had physical IT tents where they would provide free internet access and also equipment to people. And this was all crowdsourced, so ad hoc groups of people with resources, not just for technology, but also meals, medical aid, legal aid, and all kinds of other protest support. And these spaces led to collaboration between technologists and activists. So they would gather together, and then eventually they did develop new needed tech out of necessity in these spaces. There are plenty of other censorship circumvention techniques that I'll just briefly look at. For example, when there are network outages, as there were in Egypt, they relied on satellite phones and dial-up connections. There was also a history of using audio transmission and falling back as well on word of mouth when things are removed from social media. Physical pre-planning is another technique. So the IT tents are an example of that, and Facebook Hill at Standing Rock is an area of where Standing Rock, North Dakota is has spotty cell coverage. And so they labeled Facebook Hill as this hill where you can go to find cell network coverage. And that was a physical location everybody knew. If you had to post on social media, you would go to this physical location. And this works towards community-based networks. So there was local accessibility in these instances and physical ownership over the technology that was being used. So this increased the effort required to obtain the data as well as providing access to people. So the idea of a local physical network not only provides access, but also increases the effort needed to surveil these networks. The final property that I want to talk about is the importance of device compromise and deletion. And this comes from a study of anti-extradition law amendment bill protests in Hong Kong. The first this idea of security is far and beyond what we normally talk about as compromise security or post-compromise security or forward secrecy and cryptography. This is really a full spectrum compromise security. So they didn't only need to manage a key being lost, they also needed to detect whether a compromise had occurred. And they were using software that we might consider stalkerware, for example, Life360, to track other activists and figure out whether they had, gone outside the normal patterns of their operation and had been arrested. And in that case, they were using remote deletion. And they chose Telegram in large part because they had these strong deletion properties, even though in other ways it was not as secure as other encrypted messengers. And this gets at the idea of a collective security culture. So oftentimes we have a tendency to think about security on kind of an individualist level. There is a collective procedure that we can all engage in and that activists engage in to agree as a community, here are the procedures we're going to follow. And this is a group reflex to minimize information sharing, digitizing, and retaining. I want to talk a little bit about trust infrastructure for grassroots organizing, which is a new project that Sunny Kumar and I are working on. And the goal of this project is to use cryptographic tools to adapt existing trust and communication protocols of grassroots organizers from physical into digital spaces. And the goal is to do this without increasing the risk of surveillance, disinformation, and infiltration of grassroots movements. This is not a standalone platform. It's a library of primitives, and the goal of it is to apply private trust network information to any digital setting. And we'll look at a little bit about how that works. It uses an on-the-ground key agreement over QR codes and Bluetooth to root the digital trust in the system in an interpersonal interaction. Contacts hold minimal information about one another, and anybody with a shared key can delete. And finally, we think about what can be computed on device versus what can be offloaded to a server where the data sets are relatively small. So the goal is really to establish a security notion that's rooted in trust. So we're establishing human trust as a core digital security concept. And the way we're doing this is first to recognize that people build trust in all kinds of ways. There is no one-size-fits-all trust on any type of network. So we want to leave the flexibility to the organizers to be able to establish trust however they are used to establishing it. We do this by creating the idea of grounded cryptographic protocol. So this routes the overall trust in the system to grounded pairs. So it's a pairwise human interaction. And then it allows these grounded pairs to share qualitative trust measurements. This ground trust ceremony, this initial key exchange, it's kind of like a key signing ceremony in spirit, but it is establishing a symmetric key that's linked to the physical meeting. So there is no public key infrastructure here. There's no linkable persistent identifier in the system to link the activist activity over time. And then we're going to build out of this key exchange what's called a grounded annotation system. So this would let people, pairs, share digital annotations of arbitrary people, places, and things, and especially posts, events, comments that they see in digital spaces. They would be able to apply their trust to this as well. And we're not going to talk about this today, but we're working towards also grounded trust metrics that are computed privately over your social network graph. Very briefly, the key exchange looks something like this. So these are two activists, codename Alice and Bob. They're standing in physical proximity to each other. We model this using what's called an ideal functionality, which is just an ideal way that this key exchange would go, is if there's this magical entity that takes the IDs and the locations and checks whether Alice and Bob are in the same location. And if they're in the same location, then this ideal functionality passes them back a key, and they store the key. In reality, this can be done using a QR code exchange where the cryptographic information is embedded in a physical QR code that is then scanned. So you know Alice is the only person scanning it, Bob's the only person scanning it, and then they can do all of their further communication over an authenticated Bluetooth channel. This allows Alice and Bob to have a shared key rooted in their physical interaction. And what can we do with this key? We're going to set up a shared encrypted mailbox. Again, no time to go into the details, but the shared encrypted mailbox is authenticated based on the key KAB, and so only Alice and Bob have access to it. Now let's say Alice meets Charlie, and Alice wants to share with their contacts, here's my impression of the trustworthiness of this person in case you meet them on the street, you don't know who they are. I have met them, and let's say Alice writes, I met them at a mutual aid event, and they seem trustworthy. And then they upload this annotation to the mailbox. Or they say maybe this person was agitating at what was supposed to be a peaceful event. So maybe, don't trust them immediately to keep your safety interests in mind. So then they send this annotation to the mailbox, and let's say Bob meets Charlie at an event and wants to check and see if they have any mutual contacts. So they contact the mailbox, get the mail, and receive the annotation. This works also with events. So let's say Alice sees a protest and the organizer is Eve, and maybe Alice knows Eve, and Alice says, okay, so Alice gives this an identifier, for instance, by hashing it, and says, this event is being organized by friends, hope to see you there. Or maybe Alice doesn't know Eve and says, nobody can confirm Eve's identity, proceed with caution. And so they send this annotation to the system. And now Bob, if Bob sees the same event, can go and check and see if any of Bob's organizing contacts have evaluated this event for trustworthiness. So they can see whether Alice knows Eve or does not know Eve. So this allows Alice and Bob to digitally and confidentially share trust assessments of any person, place, or thing. In conclusion, I want to highlight a quote from the HRPC draft that says that we are impacting people with our designs. So every decision we make in this space holds power, and it does impact people's ability to exercise their freedom of assembly and association. And so we want to mitigate the danger, but we also want to clearly communicate to people what's going on. And so how do we go about doing this? Like, this is not a trivial task. And so I recently saw these questions in a talk given by Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, and I think it's a good starting place. Who does our work serve? Who holds power in the systems we create? Where does the trust come from? And who has meaningful choices in the systems that we create? And so in a more generative sense, I want to leave you with the question of trying to think, what kind of world do we want to build with our work? Thanks for listening. There's time for questions, so I'll stand here.
Please queue up in the mic. I think we have first Shivan.
Hey, Shivan Sahib, Brave Software. Thanks for doing the work to establish and look into the historical context for the things you're trying to do. I think that's rare, and for folks who are working in trying to work on cryptographic systems. So thanks for doing that work. And my question was, so are there use cases that have already been built upon Tigro that utilize the trust infrastructure that you're coming up with? Is there apps that use this, messaging apps or something like that?
Not yet. I hope to, so there's multiple planning stages that are happening. Right now, we're in the finishing security analysis part. And so once the paper comes out, and then I really hope to get folks together to work on this project. It's a really big task, and I want to make sure I'm being extra careful, having folks who know how to do practical security analysis, looking at the implementation side of things, because that's not my personal area of expertise. So yeah, if you're interested in getting involved in this project, I would love to have you help, and it will be open source. So, getting folks involved, definitely interested to work toward building those applications. Thanks.
Hi, Leah. Mallory Nodal. Thanks so much for this talk and for bringing this work here just to present to us. To follow on from that, just quick exchange, I hope you consider HRPC a place where you could find people to do the work or even do some of the work if there's stuff to document. I think we'd love to have that here. But my question's actually about, I can't remember what slide it was, but anyway, maybe you can just talk about the annotation a little bit more in your scheme. So I'm wondering if those annotations are actually passed to other users. Like, can Bob see Alice's annotations, or is it just a hash on the phone? Because I think one thing you've pointed out and thought about quite a lot, obviously, are in-person saboteurs, which back when, actual civic space was robust and filled with protesters, at the moment, it's rather chilled around the world for a variety of different reasons. Folks work in concert on that. So you might have one person who's a little untrustworthy, but then there could be others too. And if those annotations are public, then I imagine that's another way to check. Oh, did I make, am I listed in any annotations that say I'm untrustworthy fellow disruptor, right? So yeah, just curious about that.
Yeah, great question. So they're not public. They go only to who you indicate them going to. And so Alice is not posting that annotation of Bob publicly online. They're sending it through the encrypted mailbox. And so only people that Alice chooses to see that annotation can choose it. They could make the annotation public if they wanted to, but this system is kind of like a internal network annotation system that will help people communicate with physically trusted folks. And so the question of physical infiltrators, we don't tackle. And that's why the framing of this was, how do we not increase the risk in digital space? So we're not trying to solve a physical infiltration situation with cryptography. That's not possible. So people can always come in and kind of build those human trust relationships and not be a trustworthy person. And so that's a very difficult problem, but not one that this system aims to address.
We have Niels first. Oh, okay, Eric.
Eric Nordmark, yeah, thank you very much for this talk and the work you're doing. So this is great stuff. One thing that I wonder about is, many tools that we build can actually be used for the purposes we intend as well as for other purposes. And I don't know, in a different time and world, maybe this sort of notion that, well, transparency and visibility is one way of shining a light that sort of shows that, well, these guys are people we might be considered to be bad, right? Hate groups and whatever, because they could also use these tools to hide, right? And I don't know in this current state of things whether there's something where this system sort of at least tilts the playing field so that it's actually harder for the hate groups to actually leverage this stuff to hide their activities relative to folks that are looking more at sort of pushing an agenda of liberty and equality, etc. So I don't know if there is any work going on in that space. It would be very interesting to understand that more. It's not just about hate groups; it's also about disinformation and other things, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something to continue to think about with any open source tool that we're building in general, who that is going to be used by. I do feel like personally, as being involved in kind of directly facilitating technology trainings and other sorts of trainings that would facilitate use, for example, of the Tigro project as it is developed, the people I am working closely with are not those people that you're talking about. So not to say that I think, the technology is important in and of itself, but it's also the group of humans around the technology who are communicating and kind of educating and helping build that infrastructure from the ground up. And so I hope that everyone who works on the Tigro project and who we bring in to work on this project will go out and really help the people that are working from within marginalized communities to affect change for people in marginalized communities and who are not going to work with hate groups and other groups to help them. So I do have a lot of faith in the human aspect of this project, and I think that's where I come at it from, but that's an excellent question.
But that's clearly in terms of the people working on driving the technology and developing it, which is great, right? But as we can see with social media, it's not only been used for the Arab Spring, it's used for in Myanmar, it's being used in India in terms of ethnic hatred, right? Sort of promoting the stuff as well. So there's cases when it is being used for other purposes. And if you can just tilt the playing field a little bit, right? So it's actually somehow it's less attractive for people with those agendas. But
yeah, so I mean, they're again like very difficult problem, but I do appreciate the gravity of the problem. I do have a couple of folks, friends of mine, working on, for example, like end-to-end encrypted content moderation. These are things kind of on the horizon of being able to tell, even when the content is encrypted, without breaking the encryption or exceptional access, whether the content that is being shared over the network, the encrypted network, does contain incitements of violence or things like that. But yeah, thank you for the question, and we will keep thinking about it.
Hi, I'm Lars Eggert. Again, those was an excellent talk. Those were two excellent talks. Made me very happy. I dragged myself out of bed after a long night of karaoke yesterday. But so I'm old, right? So I remember PGP when it first came in the 90s, and so this feels a little like PGP on steroids, where you're not only like assigning trust to key, but you also then use that for other things like you describe, you annotate various things. And that is actually a very interesting idea. The question, so my question comes from my sort of initial problems in the 90s with PGP, is that the sort of web of trust concept, it has sort of natural scaling boundaries where it just becomes difficult to manage it individually at some point. And I wonder if you had sort of thought about that. Will this scale to the planet, to a country, to 100 people? What's your feeling, or do you have any data, or have you thought about this? I guess you have.
Yeah, great question. So we are, Web of Trust is definitely, yeah, there's a lot of parallels. And I think that the biggest difference is the first thing, no PKI. So that's the biggest difference, I think. But the second difference is the scale. And so the Web of Trust, originally these key signing ceremonies were who did you meet physically in person? And so the goal of this is really a community-based grassroots organizing platform. And so we're operating on a human scale. So we don't need this to scale to the planet. Like, I mean, anyone over the planet could be making their own personal networks, but as humans, we only have a certain amount of other humans who we can reasonably connect with in physical space. And so I think that the scale is a bit different. There won't be so much, I'd imagine, long distance kind of globalized communication over this platform. It will be mostly localized in around physical community spaces.
We had actually these PGP key signing ceremonies at the IETF where people got together and we signed each other's keys, and it didn't, the problem is like, so you have these opportunities where people get together and then they go off, right? And they only meet maybe never again, and I think there might be value to supporting that as well, but I understand it makes it harder. But I think there's definitely value in what you're doing, but I think there's also the notion that you and I meet here now, and that's established some trust, right? You gave a talk, I liked it, and so I probably think you know what you're talking about, so I want to, use that somehow, even if we never meet again. So that would be an interesting angle too. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would be great to have a Tigro server for people to connect in this kind of setting. Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah.
Niels ten Hoover, University of Amsterdam. Thanks so much for this excellent talk and this great work. I really appreciate how you interconnect social sciences, thorough understanding of power and technology while doing technological work. And I'm also fascinated by how you think about scale and the limitations of that. I really hope that work can go very far. A question I have is, how do you do discoverability? So how do I know that there is a Tigro object of a meeting? And so how do I know whether this meeting is the same as the other meeting and has to have a sub meeting or a beginning of it, or there's a pre-meeting or a pre-gathering? So should I know it first in person, or can I also discover it in Tigro? So I'm super curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Tigro, yeah, it's not its own platform. So it would take content, for example, from social media and like an event on social media. And then I would imagine, so we're playing with this a little bit, but the current plan is to have anything you can hash. So you would take the content that you see on social media, whether that is an event post, whether that's a comment, you could even do it for an image or a video. But you see this, okay, there's this object. And so that counts for that object you're seeing, and it counts for anybody sharing that object. So anytime you click share or retweet or whatever, it kind of takes the exact text of the object and copies it. And so that if you hash that, then you have this short identifier. That's what you would be uploading as the object ID in the Tigro system. And so as long as that event is kind of shared as is, if it's modified, it doesn't work. But if it's shared as is, then you can upload it and check and see whether anybody has uploaded information about that same hash.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Alexander Raidan, I would like to understand better the dependency on connectivity to the Tigro server. Because in my government's example, we had some protests back in 2009. And what they did is they put pressure on the mobile operators to turn off internet access in the place where the protests were happening. So is there some idea or a possibility to prepare some offline package which you can download before you go to the place, so you can make decisions on the spot without relying on connectivity?
I think that's an awesome idea. I am thinking about ways to decentralize this. One thing that does kind of already exist as the scheme was given is kind of an encrypted version of FireChat, which was a very insecure way of Bluetooth communicating during protests, that it turned out that, it was completely open. So people were just using, like a Stingray, for example, would collect all of that, or really just even monitoring the communications on the network, like sniffing traffic, would reveal the communication. But in this case, because it's an an authenticated channel, that they've shared a key, and via the QR code, they can generate an authenticated Bluetooth channel that would allow you to your devices to communicate in close proximity to people. So you could have a bunch of people, if they have shared keys, to communicate on the ground without having a network connection. But that's something I think that we would have to think about further in terms of the trust component, and doing something with that. But I think it's a great question. I'm interested in developing something like that in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There used to be a delay-tolerant networking research group, and it's now a working group. And there's a lot of research on these ad hoc spontaneous communication for all kinds of scenarios, right? Zebra tracking in Africa, out down to like fire chat came out of that at some point. So there's a lot of thing here, and I think there's a lot of overlap that would be interesting to explore. Sorry for jumping.
Great, thank you.
Hi, sorry, I didn't press the clicker because my phone's crashed. My name's Gareth, and I work at HKUST. Fantastic talk, was really interesting. I was curious, one of the challenges with these human-based trust networks is that you tend to create kind of central points of failure, because naturally some people are more popular and more mobile than other ones. And those central points then could become targets for oppressive regimes to try to get them to do things that perhaps we wouldn't want them to do. Have you thought about any mechanisms that could try to protect against that?
Yeah, so the encryption is such that the leaders, via the number of people communicating with one person, like the actual identities of the center points, are not revealed to the system. So that data is not revealed to the server. However, kind of in a human-to-human way, like if there are other side channel ways of people figuring out who the leaders are, we don't protect against that. That's, again, a human issue. So if somebody's physically on the ground and they're seeing people and seeing who the leader is, then we can't use cryptography in that case. But we are aiming to create a digital system such that these central points and the people who are really organizing are not revealed in digital space.
I was wondering, could you have some sort of attestation model where you have people repeatedly verifying the reputation of others? And then, for example, you might have trust in me, and I have trust with another person who then kind of comes all the way back around to me. Could you process that graph data to then infer that this person is still okay?
Yeah, so like talking about kind of hops in the trust network, like if I trust you and you trust someone else, then is there a measurement for me trusting that third person through you? We are thinking about that. That's very complicated. So something I didn't talk about in the talk, but it's really important, is that we need a lot of user studies for this. That's like a huge part of this project. So if you're someone who does user studies, yeah, like definitely talk to me, please. Yeah, so that's a really nice thought, and I'm not sure how it would pan out in practice. So we are thinking about that, and also with the computations over the network graph, that's kind of in preliminary stages at this time. But likely there is some trust, it's just not the same amount of trust. So it becomes very complicated. Like your trust relationship with one other person is already kind of complicated. And so then it's like, well, do I trust them enough that anybody they trust, I also trust? And so it's a more complicated trust analysis, but yeah.
Cool. As a general pointer, there was a bunch of peer-to-peer mechanisms that tried to do this to sort of establish trust between unknown peers. So there are some protocols that could perhaps help do this in a scalable way.
Interesting. Okay, we should talk.
Share them.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. The queue is closed now. And thank you again, Leah. That was a really great presentation. If you want to watch more of these novel set of talks, please watch the Cryptography for the People session at Real World Crypto. We will try to invite some of the researchers here eventually, but we have a limited amount of time at the moment. And with that.
Yeah, so everybody, can we just give a round of applause for both our speakers? Really excellent. Sorry, this is a very short housekeeping note, but the last speaker, could we just get you to give us your name for the notes? That was hard to parse. And I think actually I'm going to pass it back to you, Sophia, because we're now going to move into the drafts. So we can bring up the slides. I can do that on my phone, or the chair slides for the rest of our agenda. Okay. Great.
So first, we're going to have a little bit of an update on the draft guidelines. So Niels, if you can share a little bit about the state of the draft. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you all very much for the great engagement with the draft over the 7 years that we've been working on this draft together. And we're very happy that also in the various stages of it, we got a lot of comments. It seemed like all comments have now been addressed. And again, thanks so much for working through this with us all together. And yeah, it's been a great experience. Thank you.
So, I mean, I had an opportunity to review the latest draft. A number of comments remain unaddressed. I'd be happy to summarize, I suppose. So again, I defer to Lars, Colin in the chairs as to what I should shut up. But I believe there's still a number of technical issues unaddressed. Sure. Yeah, I went through the latest draft and some of my comments have been addressed. Thank you. A number of the others have not. As you pointed out in the list, these comments were kind of late. So I defer to Colin, the chairs, and when to shut up. But I don't think that they've been completely addressed.
Interjecting as a chair, and also the doc shepherd on this. So yeah, I think there were 2 emails from the authors to you about those changes, and they explicitly discussed where they accepted changes and then where they didn't and why. So from my perspective, while I don't think they did address everything, as a research group document that has a little less of a high bar for consensus, I was at least satisfied with their explanation for why they didn't accept changes. So I went ahead and progressed it to Colin, but now Colin's coming to the mic and I'm curious about if he's had time, because I think that just happened this week. So it's quite fresh.
Hi, Colin Pickens. So I didn't realize you had progressed it back to me. So it would help if you told me when you were doing that. This is a document which has which is a consensus document of the research group. So we do need consensus from the group, and we do need the people commenting to agree that their comments have been addressed. And as I've said a couple of times on the list, I accept that these review comments were late. I do not think it's reasonable to require a complete restructuring of the draft, and then some of the comments I think would require that to address them. But there are detailed technical comments which have not been addressed, and I think they do need to be addressed by the group. I do think having that discussion on the list until we have agreement from the people commenting, that these have been addressed needs to be done. So I don't think that the comments have been addressed, and I think would encourage the group to do so.
I think since we're together, this might be a great moment to discuss some of those issues. Sure. We would save some bits and bytes.
Absolutely. Let me see what I think the ones are probably most relevant here.
And since you have your laptop, Ecker, and I appreciate you doing that, if you could also just let us know when the last message is, like the date, because I think one of the issues is that the list activity, there hasn't been any, right? And we aren't just going to leave it open forever.
Well, okay, so I guess I can go look, but I did think that I sort of said that I didn't think that things were necessarily addressed. So, I'm happy to go through my comments in detail in email or now, I suppose, and say which ones I think were dealt with and which ones weren't. Let me just try to pull up what I have here. So again, I think we can start with this bit about content agnosticism. I think there's a really bad job of distinguishing between things that are properties of the protocol and things that are properties of other actors in the system. And if protocols either enable or do not enable traffic discrimination, differential treatment, whatever, right? But content agnosticism is a property not of the protocol, but of something else. And so this, I guess we'll check it out.
I do wonder if this may be better in a side meeting where people have a little bit of time to think about it rather than trying to do it live at the mic. Yeah.
But we did, actually, I was being a little ungenerous to the process that I initiated, because the draft actually has been in the data tracker before the doc freeze. So it's not like this happened recently. It has actually been on time. So it's just that there's so little activity on the list that I imagined that it was happening this week, but it was prior to the doc freeze. So do we want to maybe try to get consensus from a poll, AKA a hum, from the room anyway, and we can also then take it to the list?
I think you need the authors and the people commenting need to sit down and work through the issues.
So they've done that over the list. I wonder, Colin, if you could tell us how you see.
So my reading of the list is that there was not any consensus there, and the discussion was still ongoing.
My sense from the list was that the authors explained where they didn't want to incorporate certain changes and explain the reasons why, and there's been silence from there.
I think my reading was that the authors asserted that they had achieved consensus, and I didn't see a follow-up from the the people commenting, and I don't believe that it is sufficient to just assert that the comments have been addressed until you see a response from the person making the comments to say either they agree that they have been addressed, or they disagree, or they agree to disagree. You cannot simply assert that comments have been addressed without following up with the person making the comment.
This is to Niels, not me, Colin. Sorry, and you're looking at me, but I'm not the author. I'm just the shepherd. So
I
can you
understand
talk?
that you're not the author? Yes.
Okay, so I asked as Doc Shepherd, please, if the authors could reply to all of the comments made, and where they didn't agree with the proposed changes or a request for change, if they could explain why. And when I went back to the 2 messages the author sent, my view is that they had at least done that.
I agree that the authors had done that.
Okay.
Yes. I do not think that is sufficient to declare consensus until you have seen a response from the person making the comments to which they were responding.
Okay.
To say that they either agree that the comments have been addressed, they disagree and have further comments, or that they agree to disagree.
And I believe
I did not see that loop being closed.
So there was an agreement on some text changes. Niels, I want you to jump in because you have actually been, I think, talking to Ecker on the list about the text changes.
I mean, there was certainly agreement on some aspects of it, yes. My reading of the discussion was that there was not complete agreement. Ecker seems to be saying the same thing. So, you know, I think we need to revisit this and make sure that the discussion actually closes. So I think the loops are not necessarily being closed here.
So I think, just to clarify the order of operations from my perspective, the last message from me is March 14th, and it has a bunch of things where I say, like, I don't agree this addresses my comments. So I'm perfectly happy to, like, if people would like, I'm perfectly happy to go through my original review and mark up with parts that I think are addressed or not addressed. I'm happy to sit down, whatever. But and I don't care about like what happened before or after. Although again, as I said, I'll shut up and sit down when I'm told to. But like I think there are still points that are standing.
I would really appreciate if we could either sit down or whether we could actually like agree a bit on a pace.
Sure.
Because we tried to respond to everything within a week with extensive replies. And then there has been like different lengths of silences. So it's been a bit hard to accommodate and see what we could accommodate with. I'm also happy to open issues to see what we can do to address, because I think we would all be really happy to see to come to an end that satisfies everyone. So let's see if we can do that together.
And
Sure.
Again, chair hat and Doc Shepherd hat on, just to set expectations. I'm really grateful to you both for committing to have further conversation on it. However, it's also up to the rest of the research group to indicate whether or not they feel that there's consensus behind the current state of this document. It's not just Ecker, right? It's a rough consensus. It's research group rough consensus. So we really appreciate your review, Ecker, first of all, because it's very thorough. And I think it's going to make the document better. But there may be cases where we don't incorporate, or the authors don't incorporate everything. And what I care about is whether or not they've given enough good reason, and the rest of the research group is fine with those reasons. So we can aim for a deadline on this in the following, 30 days or something as such, where that would include me sort of asking the list, is everybody cool with the document as such? I would love to give that then a couple of weeks. It's not necessarily a research group last call because we've already done that, but it's just to check, right, that we're fine with that. Is that fine? Colin, can you nod? Or do you feel like that's not fine? He's coming to the mic. It's not fine.
I mean, I think in general, when trying to judge consensus, you need to get confirmation from the people making the comments to either be explicit that their comments have been addressed or that they haven't been addressed. And at that point, once that loop has been closed, you can make a consensus call. You can't make a consensus call based on silence until you have at least put some effort into to make sure that the person commenting has seen the responses and has had chance to respond.
Is that person Ecker?
In this case, it's Ecker.
Okay, good. So I think I think that's consistent with what I just said.
I think what you just said implied a timeout without closing that loop.
That wasn't my intention. I wasn't implying a timeout. I was asking for a commitment between the two of them, or I guess we include Gershabot as well, between the authors and Ecker, to try to resolve this within a reasonable amount of time on the list so that we can get to a state where we can actually then ask the rest of the research group, are we cool?
Sure.
Is that okay?
I mean, that seems like,
great.
If we can close the process, get some agreement, that seems reasonable. And I understand the frustration that this review has come in late.
Oh no, that's not my frustration.
I mean, I understand the group's frustration that this review has come in late, but my reading of this review was that there was sort of significant technical problems with this draft, and I don't think it's appropriate to publish documents that have technical flaws in. And so we need to make sure that they have been addressed, or that there is agreements that they are not, actually they're not flaws and don't need to be addressed.
Right. There are other people in the queue. I just want to make sure that you're addressing those comments directly to the person, because I'm shepherding it. I'm not the one who is pushing back on any changes. I'm trying to read what's going on.
I understand your role here, Mallory. You're asking me questions, so I'm responding to you. So this is why I'm looking at you, because you're asking me questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin, for the comments. We have other people actually on the queue. I think, is that you, Sebastian? Oh, no, okay. Please queue up on the tool. Yes.
Sorry. Thank you. All right. Hi, Sebastian Bental, New York University School of Law. This is kind of a basic question, maybe sort of contextual. What are these documents for? Like, if they are accepted, what impact does that have in the whole IRTF process? Like, what's the goal of these?
So the goal is to make this document go from an internet draft to an RFC. And the RFCs that we produce in the IRTF are informational. But in these research groups can come up with their own process through which they do that. But in HRPC, we have decided to follow pretty much the process of IETF working groups, in which we try to establish working group consensus. And the steps for that is that people work on a document, and the document gets accepted by a research group. Then the change control goes to that research group, and we go through it. Then there's a research group last call. Then there's a process of review by the Internet Research Steering Group. And then there is a poll. And just before that poll, it got kicked back to the research group because someone made a review, and we're now working through that.
Okay, but once it's an RFC, what does that accomplish?
It's a formal output document of several bodies that produce them, such as the IAB, the IETF, and IRTF.
This is a substantive question, right? This is a substantive question, not a procedural question, right? This is a substantive question, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think what he's trying to ask is, what difference does it make in the world if this document is published?
It's a normative. It's a normative output document, and what people can do with it. I think there are various variations and understandings of what an RFC means and can do in the world.
Okay, in the interest of time, please, Shivan, you're next on the list.
Hi, Shivan Sahib. I guess I have a purely process question. Does this document need working group, research group consensus or not? Because my understanding was that research group documents don't need consensus of the group. Leadership is a different question, but I'm just wondering, because we seem to be saying that word over and over again. I just don't know what that means in the context of the research group.
I guess that's a question from Colin. But in the interest of time, we're already close the queue. So I guess we're going to take the answer from Colin, and the rest I will say that take it to the list. But please be timely in your response to this draft, that he has been stressed out, has been quite a little bit of time. So please be mindful of other people's time. Go ahead, Cody.
Hi. So, and on the process point of view, IETF drafts don't necessarily need consensus of the research group. In this case, my understanding, however, is that the research group has chosen that this is a consensus draft, and therefore it needs the research group's consensus to proceed. The group could decide to publish this as a non-consensus draft, which would change the boilerplate that went onto the beginning of the draft, but would then need to document why it's being published as a non-consensus draft and whose views it is representing.
So I guess, I don't know when that sort of decision was made, honestly. I'm sure that I've been around for the life of that draft.
That was in the beginning of HRPC where we, and of that draft when we made that decision, yes.
So I'm going to say that also is something we could reconsider, but that's maybe some other question that we have to throw to Liz. So you're shaking your head, we're going to stick with a consensus document.
Well, we've been doing this since 2017, so for 30 more days, I think we can. Or like, I'm happy to work with Ecker, and I also want to respect all the work from everyone in the research group that have contributed to it. As is seen in the acknowledgement, a lot of people done it, and I think they also contributed of the idea that this was going to be a consensus document, and I want to respect that labor that everyone put in.
I mean, equally, whether it's a consensus document or not, if there are technical flaws, then those need to be addressed. And maybe we disagree on whether there are technical flaws or not, and we should have that discussion. But if there are identified flaws, they do need to be resolved.
Okay. Yes.
That's maybe a longer discussion we should have offline.
Yeah, and also about like what text implies and not necessarily what is factually there. So let's
that's a bigger discussion. Yeah.
Let's have a look at that off list. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Niels, for all the work and for the people who have been commenting on the draft. From my understanding, maybe what is needed is to have a conversation with the people who have specific comments. There has been some suggestions on how to address these specifically from Ecker on the chat. So if you're comfortable with that, the authors of the draft might do that. And we are going to move into the next item. I'm sorry. But the next item is also an update for the older draft that we have currently on HRPC, which is draft association. And go ahead, Mallory.
Yeah, Neil's also a co-author if you want to get up. It's actually it's much shorter this time, really, for sure. We'll fit within 5 minutes, maybe make up time. But we had just been waiting for quite a long time of the Doc Shepherd to put in a review. So that is done. And it is now updated in the data tracker. I think that's it. That's the story. So draft association, although I want to just make, this was a comment I meant to make before. I just really appreciated Leah, you name checking that draft in your slides, because it's been built on several different presentations that have come through HRPC over the years to address this issue. And it's like a really obvious, tangible outcome that sort of offline civic space is related to sort of the digital realm in a way that we don't see as much like in free expression or some of the other human rights works that we've done. So I'm really particularly happy about that document. And anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Yeah, I think now you have your slides. Yes? Okay. Any other points? Anybody jumping in the queue on that sorry, the queue is.
Just one very quick process point, Mallory.
Yes.
The data tracker doesn't notify people when you change the state. So if you want something to happen, it really helps to send email as well.
Okay. Good to know.
Okay, I'm going to be sharing some slides. Give me a second. Can you move? I'm not too loud. Okay. So hi, everybody. Thank you again for being here. Those two drafts that you just have this lively discussion about are not the only ones that we have been thinking of at the HRPC research group. There's currently a proposal for a draft. We're not going to be calling for adoption or anything right now. We're just going to be presenting what this draft is about. The name of the draft is well, the one that you see here, IPv4, and it's basically what it is that it does considerations or what kind of considerations in the technology that we choose to standardize we should have when thinking in intimate partner violence situations. The reason why this exists, as you might have heard on a previous iteration of this talk, is that in IETF114, we invited a speaker from CETA, which is an organization in New York that helps survivors and also ongoing victims of intimate partner with the aid of technology, on to actually guide them into how to check if their devices have been compromised by their abuser or if there's any potential trigger for them to be compromised. And it's as you just saw from Leah's talk, sometimes when we have these invited speakers that do these great presentations, we sometimes create a draft out of it because it's something that is concerning about the technology that we choose to create. So right now we have actually indeed put together this, and if you want to read it, it's already in the data tracker. Please find that specific URL in the first slide. We basically start by just giving a little bit of a definition of what this is about, what the kind of attacker is this abuser in this situation, what specific abuse technology there is. This could be from the UI level, but also from the network layer. There's some recommendations for protocol designers and any security considerations if there are any. Yes, so as I said, we are not calling for adoption or anything right now. What we're actually doing is that we welcome feedback. We do have a GitHub repository, and perhaps one of the nicer ways is either to send your feedback through the mailing list or opening that up as a GitHub issues, either on the text or the structure or overall ideas. So please provide recommendations, and specifically also provide cases where technology has not taken into account IPv cases, or also positive cases in which technology has been created with this set of guidelines in mind. So that could be kind of a positive example that readers can follow. And with that, that's all of the slides. So any questions if there are any? Yes.
Hi, sorry, Andrew Campling. From an admittedly very quick read of the draft, so apologies for not yet having read it in detail. Just an observation that some of the recommendations you may make around technology and protocols could be negative in the context of CSAM, because a lot of CSAM, an increasing percentage, is so-called self-generated. And many of the tools that could be used to prevent that, you may inadvertently be interrupting in order to deal with this problem. And I don't think there's an easy solution to that, but I think it's worth at least taking that into consideration, that you wouldn't want to, I'm sure you wouldn't intentionally want to exacerbate CSAM in order to sort of resolve this issue.
Thanks for bringing that up, Andrew. I think one of the things that I love about this approach of talking about intimate partner violence, when we also talk about, it's not just about intimate partner violence, but it also could be child abuse or other kinds of things, is that it's actually about the harm and not images of the harm. So CSAM is about getting images of abuse off of the internet, which is a bit of an abstraction, right? And so this draft has, it's overlapping. So it, I think, includes things that you're talking about, but it also goes beyond to actually try to mitigate real world in the meat space problems with abuse in a way that fundamentally can't be done when you just look at traffic going over the larger network. So I want to appreciate you bringing this to the mic and reassure you that this will be part of the considerations, but it will also be bigger than that.
So just for clarity, CSAM is not just removing images. For the self-generated considerations, it's also around the grooming process, which is absolutely similar in some instances to some of the considerations here. But we can have that conversation separately. I just wanted to flag that there's a potential conflict to be
Yes,
considered.
thank you for that. Oh, okay. That's my other co-author, so Juli, please go.
I just want to say that I think grooming is not part of what we are focused on, right?
Your name, and can you just say?
Juliana Guerra.
Yeah, but as Mallory, you just pointed out, it will be good to actually explain in a consideration sections, so we can definitely add that for sure. We have
Yeah,
Okay,
Sebastian
Niels.
actually is next, and then Niels, and then Siobhan.
I see like an acknowledgement of Tom Ristenpart's work, and I know Karen Levy, Emily's. I'm Sebastian Bentel, New York University School of Law. Right, and I see thanks to Tom Ristenpart in the document, which is because I know he's done a lot of work with people like Karen Levy and Emily Tseng on this, and I guess I'm just wondering, because I'm very new to this whole process, what the norms are around sort of references and citations to other work, and if you're following up on their recent publications.
Yes, precisely. So I have worked at some point with Thomas Ristenpart, and indeed, when we invited someone from to IETF 114, it was someone from his group. He also advises CETA in New York, so indeed we're doing that. And some of the references that you will also see in the draft are precisely from him. Currently, we're also undergoing another more scientific publication that is going to be a paper eventually with him. So yes, there's a level of involvement on that. But yeah, that's why he's in the acknowledgement. Niels? Yeah, Niels.
Niels ten Hoover, University of Amsterdam. I'd like to thank the authors for bringing this important topic and working on this excellent draft. If the authors are thus interested, I think it would be great if this could be a research group document, also because it brings in great research, but as we see here, but also through a mail on the list, it brings in excellent experts such as Leonie Tanser, who has not engaged with our community before, but has advised US, UK government, etc. So I think this really shows the usefulness of this research, its usefulness to the research group. So I really hope and would like to offer the authors my contributions and support wherever possible or needed.
Thank you, Niels. And again, if you also think that someone else should be involved that has extensively done work on that, please tell us and let us know who this person is.
Siobhan, I think you're next.
Hey, Siobhan Sahib. Thanks, Sophia. I think we might have discussed this actually in the past, but now I can't remember. The threat here is the intimate attacker, right? So the threat that you're talking about in the draft is an attacker who has access to your device. I think we could generalize from just from IPv to any such considerations that might apply to an attacker that has access to that might have access to your device, like immigration officials or your employer.
Yes, so we have been thinking about precisely that. The way that we have contextualized the draft right now addresses only the cases of IPV, specifically on sexual or romantic relationships. But there are other cases of intimate relationships. So, for example, child surveillance, or you could also have these kind of cases on geriatric institutions or in LGBTI plus device coercion, and again, also on the border control. Right now it's contextualized here because it's the start of the draft, but yes, indeed, we could expand it to other forms.
And I just to say, one of the reasons why I was really interested in this draft and maybe potential follow-on is that at CDT we work on bossware, so how enterprise or other kinds of surveillance, not just fancy Slack or whatever, are used to surveil workers. And in addition, we have another program on education, online education, and how students are surveyed by their teachers and institutions and the state sometimes. So all of these things have some very interesting common elements. And I think one way we could approach this, maybe in different or follow-on work, is to actually look and analyze the software itself, because one of the things we talked about with this is you can go on it doesn't matter which app store or how good they are at sort of policing this kind of app, and search for spouseware, which is a gross term, but you can imagine what it means, and find dozens of apps. And our sense is that they all kind of work with the same core elements of basically abusing network effects to stalk and all those things, but actually looking at the ways the technology is designed might also uncover some interesting stuff for us. So yeah, that's where we started. Go ahead,
Hi,
Colin.
Colin Perkins. So, yeah, I mean, this is clearly an important topic, and it's a good draft for this group to be working on, I think. So I would certainly support working on this topic. Following on from the comments that Siobhan and Mallory just made, I would be a little cautious about trying to broaden it too much, right? Focus drafts that talk about a particular topic tend to be easier to complete and tend to be, I think, higher impact because they can really address that one topic. So having a bunch of focus drafts, and then after you've done a few of these, perhaps trying to step back and draw some broader conclusions based on the specific focus drafts, seems to me a way of making progress faster and then being able to more clearly draw the broader conclusions rather than perhaps losing the focus. So I would encourage you to work on the focus drafts and then try and generalize rather than generalize too early.
Yes, I agree. Also, right now there's this assumption that maybe it could be applying to these general cases, but we still need to do the actual research to see if indeed it could be generalized. So at the moment it's contextualized for one, and I think it's fair to have it that way. We can start others to looking at other situations, and then maybe kind of for us, after learning about it, actually see which kind of those can be generalized for different situations.
Right.
Thanks, Sophia. I think we just have like 2 seconds for our last agenda item, which is on the charter. And I actually really failed here I was meant to bring up a really obvious sort of what do you call it, change control slide on what we've modified, and I didn't do that. So in fact, we don't actually have any slides. But to catch everyone up, we can maybe have a quick conversation, and I'll give you an update on where it's at. We made pretty incisive changes. Other than the obvious one, we're going to change the P in our acronym we're proposing to change the P in our acronym from protocol to policy so that we can just, I think arguably folks have made the argument that we're not actually going to be changing what we're doing. We're just putting it in the charter a little bit more explicitly that sometimes work on human rights also can be relevant to policy discussions as well. Though that there are changes in the charter text that reflect that slight shift. We also took the opportunity to remove certain kinds of work items that we're not actually working on anymore, and other sort of tidy ups. Right now, the state of it is, Colin and I have had a discussion about some remaining questions around the question of guidance specifically. So we do in our current charter have a line about guidelines to the IETF, and my sort of proposed charter text made that too ambiguous. And it's an important thing to get right, because in the past, the research group has needed to tread carefully around that, because the IRTF cannot really tell the IETF what to do. That I think, so I want to make sure that the next revision of it hones in on that particular line and gets it better. So I haven't had a chance to sit down and do that yet because Colin and I just discussed it last night. So you're all waiting for me, and I'm afraid I'll have to take it onto the list again. I don't think we can get a hum or anything around finalized charter text this morning. We also don't have time for that. But we do have time for anyone if you want to get in the queue, especially Colin, if you wanted to jump in since I just name checked you. Oh, and John, thank you for coming up because you've also commented on the list. I appreciate that.
Yeah, Colin Picks, I don't have much to add other than what you to what you said earlier. As you said, myself and yourself and Miria had a comment had a discussion last night based on some comments Miria made on the draft charter. I think it's close. That there's clearly some disagreements that we're in the process of resolving, but I think it's close.
I think we agree. I think we just don't have a text that, that we agree on because I haven't written it yet.
Phrase it just quite right.
Yeah, and thanks for that very much, Colin. Hey, John, go ahead.
John Curran, Aaron, but speaking on behalf of myself, I just want to encourage the working group chairs to not redefine the term addressed. And what I mean by that is, I think you're doing a great job in handling the drafts and the working group material. Addressed has a very traditionally meant understanding. It meant the authors or the working group have considered the comments, may not have been accepted, may not have been resolved, but they've been considered. To the extent that a document has had all the issues considered, then they are addressed and it's valid to move ahead with a document and call for a consensus from the group. It's not required to have a positive lock on each and every comment to make sure the author agrees with the consideration. If we're going to change the rules, let's all have a discussion of that, but I think you're doing a great job with your interpretation of it.
Thank you, John. And for someone making a comment about addressing from you, that is highly regarded. Thank you. You're welcome.
Hi, Mark. I'm with the UK's Department for Science, Innovation and Tech. I really like the recharter. I think it's a positive direction, as you say, kind of making it clear the work that the group has already been doing. And I think that helps kind of, really kind of make the work stronger. On the charter text, specifically, I really think that kind of recognizing the kind of foundational view that technical decisions do have these kind of wider implications and kind of cause these ripple effects is important. And I also thought that kind of drawing out the kind of idea that it's important to understand the kind of policy or wider implications of technical decisions, but also kind of the other way and kind of the kind of technical implications of policy decisions, and having that kind of two-way bridge is really good.
Thanks, Merrick. And if you're really jazzed about the whole tech is political angle, we have a languished expired draft that you might check out that never went anywhere ultimately, that was trying to create an argument for that. You might just read it and see what you think. But sorry, Niels. Hi, Aubrey. Well, Aubrey, former co-chair, actually founding co-chair of this group. Welcome to the mic.
And very slow sometimes. I just wanted to ask, in the charter change, one of the things that had always interested me and I felt frustrated by was that we couldn't go into how these things were implemented, how these things are deployed. Does this open up those as being in scope? And perhaps it does, and it says it. I haven't quite understood it yet, so treat me as slow.
I'm super intrigued now. I didn't know that that was part of a historical conversation and the way the charter was formed the first time. I particularly would find that interesting.
Right. Yeah,
But-
no, we had, in fact, while I was still playing chair, we had a couple times where we had people come in with contributions that weren't about the protocol itself, but it was how they were being implemented. It was how they were being deployed. And we deemed it to be sort of out of scope. And I'm wondering if by changing the P from protocol to policy, we've opened that up to being in scope.
Right. And I mean, just for folks, if this is too inside baseball, I mean, there is a known gap between the standard and the implementation that the IETF in general does not touch, does not work on. Nobody's the protocol police, et cetera, et cetera. But from a real world impact perspective, that sort of matters quite a lot. So I don't know if we want to include that in the charter. Maybe take a look at the new charter text, which I'm going to be sending to the list imminently, and see if there's a place where we can sneak it in, and then see if it causes anybody to freak out.
Okay, so at the moment, policy does not include it in your understanding. Okay, that was really my question. Thanks.
Well, it could be, and we could probably do a lot implicitly with that very capacious word policy. I don't know that we want to try to be and get away with it. I think it'd be rather better if it were in the, so that nobody could then come screaming
Because
later.
that was the big frustration that made me walk away.
Oh,
So-
gosh. Well, we should fix that.
Lars, I got a data tracker locked me out and doesn't let me back in, so I can't get in the queue. I was going to say, so unlike for working groups over on the IETF side, the reason or motivation for a research group charter is sort of slightly different, right? It's not there to like clearly define what's in and outside. It's much more sort of a description for outside to know whether somebody could be interested to participate or not, right? So I don't think you need to like worry about every word or every character here. It's much more, you know, how this group advertised itself to others that might find this and wonder whether this is something for them or not, right? So, you know, whether it's deployment or implementation, I can't recall that we ruled that out. I don't think there was
You were the chartering.
I know
IRTF
there's a lot
chair,
I don't
right?
remember, but I don't think there's a reason to turn down interesting work just because, you know, it's maybe a little bit outside the charter. This is a research group, right? So this is how we learn stuff.
Okay. Yeah, Aubrey, please, if you could suggest something, I would be welcoming to it. I think that's it. We've gone over time. I appreciate your 7 minutes that you gave us in addition to the 2 hours. Again, want to thank our speakers. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you in San Francisco.